Some men eventually reach a point where they stop trying to explain themselves entirely, not because they have nothing to say, but because experience taught them most people only understand emotions they personally relate to. So the emotionally detached man becomes selective. Selective with words, selective with trust, selective with access. He no longer reveals his inner world easily, and over time, his internal world becomes a locked room. Very few people ever enter it. This creates a strange contradiction inside many emotionally detached men. Externally, they appear strong. Internally, they often feel profoundly alone, because strength without emotional connection eventually becomes isolation, and isolated minds change. The isolated man spends enormous time thinking, replaying conversations, replaying betrayals, replaying failures, analyzing human behavior constantly. This is why many emotionally detached men become psychologically intense. Silence increases observation, and observation changes perception. The man begins noticing how performative people are, how conditional relationships are, how often human interaction is driven by self-interest. These realizations make emotional openness harder because innocence no longer exists, and once innocence dies, relationships become psychologically complicated. The emotionally detached man no longer enters relationships hoping. He enters cautiously, scanning for inconsistencies, scanning for manipulation, scanning for signs of future pain. And this hyper-awareness can destroy intimacy before intimacy even begins. Because true connection requires emotional risk, but emotionally detached men are trained to avoid risk at all costs emotionally. Many of them would rather lose connection than lose control. That sentence explains more male psychology than people realize. Control becomes sacred to emotionally wounded men because chaos once destroyed them internally. So now they control routines, control reactions, control emotions, control expectations. Some even control their entire lives obsessively. Discipline becomes identity. Wake up early, train hard, work constantly, stay busy, stay distracted, because stillness forces emotion to surface. And many emotionally detached men are terrified of what exists underneath the silence. Not because they are evil, because buried pain accumulates over years. Unprocessed grief, unspoken anger, invisible loneliness. The emotional system becomes overloaded, so the man chooses numbness instead. Numbness feels manageable, pain does not. This is why many emotionally detached men secretly admire emotionally expressive people, even if they never admit it. A part of them envies emotional freedom, the ability to cry openly, love openly, trust openly, because deep down, many emotionally detached men remember when they used to be that way, before life changed them, before betrayal made them suspicious, before failure made them guarded, before loneliness became familiar. And loneliness does become familiar after enough time. In fact, some men become so accustomed to emotional isolation, they begin rejecting connection automatically, not consciously, instinctively. A healthy relationship feels uncomfortable. Kindness feels suspicious. Emotional safety feels unfamiliar because the nervous system adapts to survival mode. Peace can feel strange to someone who spent years psychologically preparing for disappointment. That is one of the hidden consequences of emotional trauma in men. The trauma becomes normalized. The man no longer sees his emotional shutdown as damage. He sees it as maturity, as evolution, as strength, and society often reinforces this belief. The cold man is respected. The detached man is mysterious. The emotionally unreadable man appears powerful, but appearances hide consequences, because emotional suppression slowly affects everything. relationships become shallow. Friendships become distant. Life becomes repetitive. The emotionally detached man often becomes highly functional externally, while feeling emotionally absent internally. And this emotional absence creates another dangerous habit: escapism. Some escape through work, others through entertainment, others through alcohol, substances, or endless distraction. Anything to avoid sitting alone with unresolved emotion. Because unresolved emotion is heavy, especially for men taught never to express it. That weight accumulates quietly over years, and eventually some men stop believing anyone could understand them, even if they tried explaining. So they stop trying entirely. This creates emotional isolation at the deepest level, not physical isolation, psychological isolation, the feeling that nobody truly sees you, nobody truly knows you, nobody truly understands the pressure you carry internally. That feeling changes men, especially when experienced for long periods. A psychologically isolated man becomes emotionally self-contained. He stops expecting comfort from others, stops expecting emotional support, stops expecting understanding, and expectations shape emotional behavior. When a man expects nothing emotionally, he becomes emotionally self-reliant. But extreme self-reliance often creates emotional detachment, because dependence starts feeling dangerous. Trust starts feeling dangerous. Need starts feeling dangerous. So the man eliminates emotional need entirely, or at least attempts to. But human beings cannot completely eliminate emotional need. They can only suppress it temporarily. Eventually, the loneliness resurfaces, usually at night, usually in silence, usually when distractions disappear, because silence exposes emotional truth. And many emotionally detached men secretly know something is missing internally. Even if they never say it aloud, they know they are surviving, not fully living. There is a difference. Survival is defensive. Living requires emotional openness, and openness is terrifying to someone who built his entire personality around emotional protection. That is why emotionally detached men often struggle with intimacy. Not physical intimacy, emotional intimacy. Being emotionally seen feels dangerous. Being emotionally known feels risky, because exposure creates the possibility of pain. And emotionally detached men fear emotional pain more than almost anything. Not because they are weak, because they remember what emotional destruction felt like the first time. People underestimate how deeply emotional pain can affect male psychology. A single betrayal can change how a man views women permanently. A single humiliation can change how he views vulnerability permanently. A single period of abandonment can change how he views attachment permanently. Pain creates patterns, and repeated pain creates identity. This is why some emotionally detached men become obsessed with power. Power reduces vulnerability, money, status, influence, control. These things create psychological distance from helplessness. And helplessness is what many emotionally detached men fear most, because helplessness reminds them of the moments life broke them emotionally. So now they seek control relentlessly, but no amount of external control can fully heal internal emptiness. That is why many highly disciplined, highly successful men still feel emotionally disconnected. Achievement cannot replace emotional peace. Control cannot replace connection, and suppression cannot replace healing. Eventually, every emotionally detached man reaches one of two paths. He either remains emotionally armored forever, or he slowly learns how to feel safely again. The first path creates permanent distance. The second path requires enormous courage, because healing demands honesty. Honesty about pain, honesty about fear, honesty about loneliness. And many men were never taught how to speak honestly about emotional suffering, so they stay silent instead, sometimes for decades, until the silence itself becomes unbearable. That is when many emotionally detached men finally realize the armor protected them from pain, but it also protected them from life itself, from love, from connection, from emotional peace, from genuine understanding. And perhaps the deepest tragedy is this: many emotionally detached men are still waiting for one thing they rarely admit aloud: a place where they no longer have to be emotionally guarded to survive, a place where weakness will not be weaponized, a place where honesty will not be punished, a place where vulnerability will not be used against them, because beneath the silence, beneath the coldness, beneath the emotional walls, most emotionally detached men are not searching for power. They are searching for safety, and many of them have spent their entire lives not knowing where to find it. 2. The frightening thing about emotional detachment is that it does not always look destructive in the beginning. Sometimes it looks impressive. The emotionally detached man often becomes disciplined, focused, calm under pressure, highly independent. People admire him. They admire the silence, the self-control, the emotional restraint. But what they often do not see is the emotional exhaustion underneath the performance, because there are two very different kinds of emotionally detached men. One becomes wise, the other becomes dangerous, and the difference between them is whether pain created understanding or bitterness. A wise man experiences suffering and becomes more aware. A bitter man experiences suffering and becomes emotionally hostile. Both were hurt, but they responded differently. The wise man learns boundaries. The bitter man learns revenge. The wise man becomes emotionally disciplined. The bitter man becomes emotionally cold. The wise man understands human flaws. The bitter man begins hating humanity itself. This is why unresolved emotional pain in men can become psychologically dangerous, not always outwardly dangerous, sometimes internally dangerous, because suppressed pain eventually changes how a man views life. If the pain remains unresolved long enough, the man can begin disconnecting from empathy itself. And empathy is what keeps human beings emotionally balanced. Without empathy, relationships become transactional. People become objects. Connection becomes strategy. This is why some emotionally detached men become manipulative, not because they were born manipulative, but because emotional pain taught them vulnerability equals weakness. So they adapt through emotional control. They stop trying to connect emotionally. They start trying to dominate psychologically. Control becomes their substitute for trust. And this mindset can quietly poison relationships. The man no longer asks, "How do I build connection?" He asks, "How do I avoid losing power?" That shift changes everything. Love becomes negotiation. Trust becomes suspicion. Affection becomes calculated. Eventually, the man no longer knows how to connect without maintaining emotional distance. And emotional distance can slowly become emotional emptiness. But not every emotionally detached man becomes bitter. Some become deeply reflective instead. These men suffer silently, but use suffering to understand themselves. Pain humbles them. Pain matures them. Pain sharpens their perception without destroying their humanity. These are the men who discover true stoicism, not fake stoicism, not emotional suppression disguised as masculinity. Real stoicism, the ability to remain emotionally stable without becoming emotionally dead. That distinction matters enormously, because emotional numbness is not mastery. Real emotional mastery means you still feel pain, but pain no longer controls your behavior. You still feel sadness, but sadness no longer destroys your identity. You still feel emotion, but emotion no longer dictates every decision. That is strength, not emotional shutdown. Many men misunderstand this. They think becoming untouchable emotionally makes them powerful. But complete emotional detachment creates emptiness, not peace. Peace requires emotional balance, and balance is much harder than suppression. Suppression is immediate. Balance requires healing. And healing is difficult for emotionally detached men because healing forces confrontation. Confrontation with memories, confrontation with loneliness, confrontation with unresolved grief. Many men spend years distracting themselves from this confrontation. Constant work, constant goals, constant movement, because slowing down means feeling, and feeling is what they train themselves to avoid. This is why many emotionally detached men secretly fear silence. Not external silence, internal silence, the kind where distractions disappear and unresolved emotions begin surfacing again. That is when the mind starts replaying everything: the betrayal, the rejection, the humiliation, the loneliness. The man realizes he never truly healed. He only buried things deeper, and buried emotions do not disappear. They wait, sometimes for years, until one moment breaks the emotional dam completely. A divorce, a death, a major failure, a period of complete isolation. Suddenly years of suppressed emotions surface at once. And this is often when emotionally detached men finally collapse internally, not dramatically, quietly. The frightening thing about male emotional collapse is how invisible it can be. Many men continue functioning externally while psychologically falling apart internally. They still go to work, still smile occasionally, still complete responsibilities. They feel disconnected from everything, but internally, they feel disconnected from everything. This is why many emotionally detached men say they feel empty instead of sad. Sadness still feels alive. Emptiness feels absent, like something essential disappeared from inside them years ago. And sometimes, that emptiness comes from grieving versions of themselves they never got back. The younger self, the hopeful self, the emotionally open self. Life hardened them so aggressively that eventually they stopped recognizing themselves emotionally. That realization hurts deeply, especially for men who remember being softer once. Many emotionally detached men secretly miss feeling emotions normally, miss excitement, miss emotional safety, miss genuine trust. But after years of emotional armor, they no longer know how to return to openness safely, so they stay guarded, even when they desperately want connection. And this creates one of the most painful experiences in male psychology: wanting intimacy, while simultaneously fearing it. The emotionally detached man often pushes away the very thing he secretly wants most, not because he enjoys loneliness, but because loneliness feels more predictable than emotional risk. Predictability becomes comfort, and emotionally wounded men become addicted to emotional predictability. That is why routines become sacred, why control becomes sacred, why emotional distance becomes sacred. Anything that minimizes emotional uncertainty feels psychologically safer, but safety without connection eventually becomes isolation, and isolation changes perception over time. The isolated man begins viewing himself differently. He starts believing, no one understands me, no one truly cares, I'm better off alone. At first, these thoughts feel protective. Eventually, they become prisons, because repeated emotional isolation slowly reshapes identity. The man stops seeing himself as emotionally human. He begins seeing himself as emotionally separate from everyone else, different, disconnected, unreadable. And once someone identifies strongly with emotional isolation, returning to vulnerability becomes extremely difficult. because vulnerability now feels unnatural, even threatening. This is why emotionally detached men often struggle when they finally meet genuinely kind people. They cannot fully trust the kindness. A healthy person confuses them because they spent years psychologically adapting to emotional danger. Now, emotional safety feels suspicious. That is what long-term emotional defense does to the nervous system. It changes what feels normal. Chaos feels normal. Distance feels normal. Guardedness feels normal. Peace feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things often feel unsafe. This is why healing emotionally detached men requires patience, not pressure, not judgment. Patience, because emotional openness cannot be forced. Trust cannot be demanded, especially from someone whose trust was repeatedly broken. Healing begins when the man finally realizes something important. Protecting yourself emotionally is necessary. Living emotionally closed forever is destructive. Both truths exist at the same time. A healthy man learns boundaries without losing emotional depth. That is balance, not emotional recklessness, not emotional shutdown. Balance, the ability to love without losing yourself. The ability to trust carefully without becoming paranoid. The ability to remain strong without becoming emotionally numb. That is real emotional maturity. And perhaps this is the lesson many emotionally detached men eventually learn too late. Strength was never supposed to mean becoming incapable of feeling. True strength means remaining human. After life gave you every reason not to, there comes a moment in some men's lives where the emotional mask becomes too heavy to carry, not because the world suddenly became softer, but because pretending to feel nothing eventually becomes exhausting. A man can only suppress himself for so long before something inside him begins demanding honesty. That honesty usually arrives in silence, late at night, during isolation, after loss, after burnout, after years of emotional survival. The man begins asking himself difficult questions. When was the last time I truly felt alive? When was the last time I trusted someone completely? Who did I become? What happened to me? Those questions are dangerous, because once a man starts confronting his emotional reality honestly, he can no longer hide behind performance. And many emotionally detached men are masters of performance, performing strength, performing control, performing indifference. But performance is not peace. A man can appear composed externally while collapsing internally, and eventually the inner collapse becomes impossible to ignore. This is where many emotionally detached men face a crossroads. One path leads deeper into emotional isolation, the other leads toward healing. The first path feels easier initially. Stay guarded. The first path feels easier initially. Stay guarded, stay detached, stay emotionally unreachable. Never trust fully again. Never love deeply again. Never risk vulnerability again. This path feels safe, but safety without emotional connection slowly becomes emptiness. The man survives, but emotionally he stops experiencing life fully. Years pass quickly this way. Wake up, work, distract yourself, repeat. No emotional depth, no real intimacy, no emotional freedom, only control. And control becomes lonely after enough time, because human beings are not machines. Even the strongest men still need emotional meaning, still need connection, still need understanding, still need peace, and no amount of discipline can fully replace those things. This is why some emotionally detached men eventually realize they built an entire life around avoiding pain instead of pursuing fulfillment. That realization changes everything, because avoiding pain and pursuing peace are not the same thing. Many men confuse the two. Avoiding pain creates emotional walls. Pursuing peace requires emotional wisdom. Wisdom says, yes, the world can hurt you, but shutting yourself off from life completely hurts you too. That is the difficult truth emotionally detached men eventually confront. The armor worked, but the armor also cost them parts of themselves. Their softness, their emotional openness, their ability to feel deeply without fear. And perhaps the hardest realization of all is understanding this. The world did not only wound them, they also wounded themselves trying to survive it. Every time they suppressed emotion, every time they isolated themselves, every time they convinced themselves they did not need anyone, a small part of their emotional humanity disappeared quietly, not dramatically, slowly. And slow emotional death is difficult to notice while it's happening, especially in a culture that rewards emotional numbness in men. People praise the man who never reacts, the man who never breaks, the man who never needs help, but nobody asks what constant emotional suppression is doing to him internally. Nobody sees the psychological fatigue, the loneliness, the emotional starvation, because emotionally detached men often suffer invisibly, and invisible suffering is dangerous, not only because it hurts, but because eventually the man himself stops believing his pain matters. That is one of the darkest stages of emotional detachment, when a man becomes so disconnected from his own emotions. He no longer knows how to care for himself psychologically. He only knows how to endure. And endurance is not the same as healing. A man can endure misery for decades. Healing requires something much harder: self-confrontation. The emotionally detached man must eventually confront the grief underneath the armor, the grief of betrayal, the grief of lost innocence, the grief of emotional abandonment, the grief of becoming someone he never intended to become. Because many emotionally detached men never planned to become cold. Life shaped them there gradually, one disappointment at a time, one heartbreak at a time, one humiliation at a time, until eventually the emotional walls became automatic. And now the man faces the terrifying task of learning how to feel again safely, not recklessly, safely. That distinction matters. Healing does not mean becoming emotionally naive again. It means learning balance, learning that boundaries and vulnerability can coexist, learning that strength and emotion can coexist, learning that being emotionally open does not make a man weak. In fact, it may be one of the hardest things a man can do after years of emotional suppression, because emotional honesty requires courage, real courage, not aggression, not dominance, not emotional shutdown. Courage is saying, yes, I was hurt. Yes, I became guarded. Yes, I lost parts of myself. But I refuse to become emotionally dead forever. That is strength, and very few men are taught that version of strength. Many are taught only extremes: be soft and get destroyed, or become cold and survive. But healthy masculinity exists between those extremes. A balanced man is capable of emotion without drowning in it, capable of discipline without losing humanity, capable of love without losing self-respect. That balance is rare because pain pushes people toward extremes, especially male pain. Male suffering often goes unseen until it transforms into something visible: anger, isolation, bitterness, emotional numbness. But underneath many emotionally detached men is unresolved grief. Grief for relationships, grief for dreams, grief for versions of themselves they buried to survive. And grief changes people profoundly, especially unspoken grief. The world often allows women emotional spaces to process pain openly. Many men never receive those spaces, so they internalize everything. And internalized pain changes personality over time. That is why some men slowly disappear emotionally from the world. Not physically, emotionally. They stop participating fully, stop expressing fully, stop trusting fully. They become observers instead of participants in life, watching, analyzing, remaining emotionally distant from everything. At first, this distance feels intelligent. Later, it feels empty because observation cannot replace connection forever. Eventually, the emotionally detached man realizes something important. Being hard to hurt also made him hard to reach, and being unreachable is lonely, no matter how strong the mask appears externally. The truth is, many emotionally detached men are exhausted from pretending they do not care, because caring never actually disappeared. It was buried under disappointment, buried under betrayal, buried under years of emotional self-protection. But buried emotions still exist, and sometimes all the emotionally detached man truly wants is one thing he has not felt in years: the ability to lower his guard without fear, to speak honestly without punishment, to feel deeply without shame, to trust without expecting betrayal. Not perfection, just emotional safety, because beneath the silence, beneath the stoicism, beneath the emotional armor, there is often a man who became cold simply because life taught him warmth was dangerous. And perhaps the saddest truth of all is this: many emotionally detached men never wanted to become emotionless. They simply became tired of bleeding where nobody cared to bandage the wound.